They were blamed for plagues they did not cause, wars they did not start, and crises they could not control. Across centuries and continents, one small minority became the target of fear, suspicion, and violence. Again and again, the question is not simply why it happened once, but why it kept happening, why the pattern endured. To understand it, you have to go back not to a single moment, but to a long chain of history where religion, politics, economics, and human psychology intertwined into something far more dangerous than prejudice alone. In the ancient world, the Jewish people were already set apart. Their origins trace back thousands of years in the Near East, bound by a distinct identity centered on monotheism, the belief in one God, at a time when most surrounding civilizations worshipped many. This difference was not just theological, it shaped laws, customs, and daily life. They observed dietary restrictions, practiced rituals unfamiliar to outsiders, and maintained a strong sense of communal identity. In empires like Rome, difference could be tolerated, but only to a point. When the Jewish population in Judea resisted Roman rule, tensions erupted into open rebellion. The consequences were catastrophic. In 70 CE, Roman forces destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, a sacred center of Jewish life. The land was devastated, and many Jews were killed, enslaved, or scattered. This marked the beginning of a long diaspora. Jewish communities dispersed across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. But dispersion did not bring anonymity. It brought visibility without power. As Jewish communities settled in foreign lands, they often lived as minorities under rulers who saw them as both useful and expendable. They were frequently barred from owning land or joining guilds, limiting their economic opportunities. In many parts of medieval Europe, Jews were pushed into roles others avoided or were forbidden to take. Most notably, money lending. This would prove to be one of history's most dangerous setups. In Christian Europe, lending money with interest, usury, was condemned by the church. Yet economies still needed credit. Jewish lenders filled this gap, becoming essential to kings, nobles, and merchants alike. But this role came with a paradox. They were needed, but resented. Debtors feared them, rulers taxed them heavily, and when debts grew too large, eliminating the lender became an appealing solution. It is here that economics began to merge with myth. During times of crisis, especially the Black Death in the 14th century, fear turned into hysteria. As the plague swept through Europe, killing millions, people searched desperately for someone to blame. Jews, already viewed as outsiders, became convenient scapegoats. Rumors spread that they had poisoned wells. There was no evidence, only panic. Entire communities were burned, expelled, or massacred. The pattern was becoming clear. In times of uncertainty, societies often turned against those who were different, visible, and politically vulnerable. Jews fit all three. Religion intensified this hostility. In medieval Christian teachings, Jews were often portrayed as responsible for the death of Jesus, a charge that carried enormous emotional weight. Over generations, this accusation hardened into doctrine and prejudice, shaping attitudes across Europe. Jews were depicted not just as different, but as morally suspect, even dangerous. Yet even as they faced persecution, Jewish communities endured. They built networks, preserved traditions, and adapted to new environments. In places like Spain, there were periods of relative tolerance, where Jews contributed to science, philosophy, and culture. But these moments were fragile. In 1492, Spain's rulers, Ferdinand and Isabella, issued the Alhambra decree, ordering all Jews to convert to Christianity or leave the country. Tens of thousands fled. Those who converted, known as conversos, often remained under suspicion, accused of secretly practicing Judaism. The Spanish Inquisition pursued them relentlessly, blending religious zeal with state power. The message was unmistakable: assimilation offered no guaranteed safety. As Europe moved into the early modern period, old prejudices did not disappear, they evolved. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about reason and equality, and in some places, Jews were granted civil rights. But acceptance was uneven and often conditional. Jews were expected to abandon their distinct identity to be fully accepted, a demand that created tension within both Jewish and non-Jewish societies. At the same time, new forms of hostility emerged, less overtly religious, but no less dangerous. By the 19th century, anti-Semitism was increasingly framed in racial and national terms. Jews were no longer just seen as a religious group, but as a separate race that could never truly belong. This shift was critical. Religious prejudice, in theory, allowed for conversion. Racial ideology did not. In countries like Germany, Austria, and France, Jews were both integrating into society and becoming more visible in professions such as law, medicine, journalism, and finance. For some, this success became another source of resentment. Conspiracy theories spread, claiming that Jews controlled banks, governments, or the press. These ideas were not new, but they were becoming more organized, more political. In Russia, Jews faced violent pogroms, organized massacres often tolerated or encouraged by authorities. Entire villages were destroyed, families were uprooted, waves of Jewish refugees fled westward, carrying with them stories of brutality that shocked the world, but did little to stop the violence. And then, in the heart of Europe, the most extreme and devastating chapter began to take shape. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany was a nation humiliated and unstable. Economic collapse, political chaos, and national resentment created fertile ground for radical ideas. Into this environment stepped a movement that would turn centuries of prejudice into a systematic ideology of destruction. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party did not invent anti-Semitism, but they weaponized it with unprecedented intensity. They portrayed Jews as the source of Germany's problems: economic hardship, cultural decline, political instability. Using propaganda, pseudoscience, and relentless messaging, they dehumanized Jewish people, reducing them to symbols of everything the regime claimed to oppose. Step by step, rights were stripped away. Jews were excluded from professions, banned from public spaces, and isolated from society. The Nuremberg laws codified discrimination into law, defining who was considered Jewish and removing their citizenship. Then came the violence. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, saw synagogues burned, businesses destroyed, and thousands arrested. It was no longer just rhetoric. It was a warning of what was to come. During World War II, that warning became reality on a scale the world had never seen. The Holocaust was not a spontaneous act of hatred. It was a coordinated, industrialized system of genocide. Millions of Jews were deported to ghettos, concentration camps, and extermination camps. Families were separated. Lives were reduced to numbers. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews had been murdered. It was the culmination of centuries of prejudice, transformed into a machinery of death. But even after the Holocaust, the story did not simply end. Anti-Semitism did not vanish with the defeat of Nazi Germany. It persisted, sometimes openly, sometimes beneath the surface. In the modern era, it has taken new forms. Conspiracy theories have adapted to new technologies. Old stereotypes resurface in different language. Political conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, have sometimes fueled hostility toward Jewish people worldwide, blurring the line between criticism of policies and prejudice against a people. What makes this history so enduring is not a single cause, but a convergence of forces. Religious differences created early divisions. Economic roles fostered resentment. Political leaders exploited these tensions for power. Social crises turned fear into blame. And over time, myths hardened into beliefs that could be passed down generation after generation. At its core, the targeting of Jews reflects a broader human pattern: the search for a scapegoat in times of uncertainty. When societies face crises they cannot easily explain or control, they often look for a group to hold responsible. The more distinct and vulnerable that group is, the easier it becomes to assign blame. The Jewish experience, repeated across centuries, became one of the most tragic examples of this pattern. And yet, it is also a story of resilience. Despite expulsions, massacres, and genocide, Jewish communities have survived. They have preserved their identity, rebuilt their lives, and continued to contribute to the cultures and societies around them. Their history is not only one of suffering, but of endurance in the face of relentless adversity. The question that remains is not just why it happened, but what it reveals. It reveals how fear can be shaped into hatred, how difference can be turned into division, and how narratives, once accepted, can justify actions that would otherwise seem unthinkable. It shows how quickly societies can move from suspicion to exclusion and from exclusion to violence. And it serves as a warning, because the forces that drove this history, fear, uncertainty, the desire for simple answers to complex problems, are not confined to the past. They are part of human nature, capable of resurfacing in new forms against new targets. The story of why Jews have been targeted for so long is not just about one people. It is about the mechanisms of prejudice itself, how it begins, how it spreads, and how, if left unchecked, it can lead to unimaginable consequences. History does not repeat itself in the same way, but it echoes. And in those echoes lies a choice: to recognize the patterns or to relive them.